CEO slapped pregnant wife in court. DNA test revealed he was living off her trust fund. A 60-minute drama. Remastered version. Hook, the sound of his palm hitting her cheek echoed through the courtroom. 8 months pregnant, standing before a judge. And the man she loved for 5 years had just slapped her across the face in front of everyone. But that satisfying crack of skin against skin was not the worst part. The DNA test results in her attorney's hands would reveal something far more devastating than infidelity. Her husband did not exist. The charming tech CEO, she had married a ghost. A character played by a man whose real name she had never heard. The $40 million company he ran, completely fabricated. Every employee she had met at company parties, actors hired to perform, and the woman she thought was his mistress. She was not his lover at all. She was his sister, his partner in crime for 11 years. $800,000 stolen. Her father's entire life insurance. Every penny her daddy had worked himself to death for. Gone. But Rachel Dawson was not going to cry in that courtroom. She was not going to beg. She was going to build an army, hunt him down, and burn his perfect lie to the ground. This is the story of how one ordinary woman lost everything to a professional con man, how she united the survivors he had left broken in his wake, and how she made him watch from a prison cell as she became everything he said she could never be. Stay until the very end, because what happens to him 5 years later will give you chills. Value and lessons. Before we begin, I want you to understand something important. This story contains real warning signs, real red flags that Rachel missed because she did not know what to look for. I am going to point them out as we go. Not to blame her, never to blame her, but so you can protect yourself, your daughters, your sisters, your friends, because men like the one in this story do not look like monsters. They look like Prince Charming. They say all the right things. They make you feel like the most special woman in the world. And by the time you realize what they really are, your bank account is empty and your heart is shattered. 1 in 10 women will experience financial abuse in their lifetime. 1 in 10. That means someone you know, someone you love, maybe even you. So pay attention. Take notes if you need to. Share this with someone you care about, because the best defense against a predator is knowing exactly how they hunt. If this story helps even one person recognize the signs before it is too late, then every word was worth it. Now, let us begin. Chapter 1: The Perfect Lie. Rachel Dawson had the kind of life that looked perfect from the outside. At 34 years old, she taught senior English at Jefferson High School in suburban Ohio. Her students loved her. They wrote her thank you notes at graduation. They came back years later to tell her she had changed their lives. She drove a sensible Honda Civic with 120,000 miles on it. She lived in a 3-bedroom house with a mortgage she could actually afford, in a neighborhood where people still waved at each other from their front porches. Nothing fancy, nothing extravagant, just a good, solid, middle-class life built on hard work and modest dreams. But the best part of her life, the part that made her heart sing every single morning, was the man sleeping beside her, Garrett Mitchell. She watched him now in the early morning light filtering through their bedroom curtains. His dark hair was tousled against the white pillow. His handsome face was relaxed in sleep, even unconscious. He looked like something out of a magazine. 5 years together, 3 years married, and she still could not believe he had chosen her. A tech CEO worth millions, and he had fallen in love with a high school English teacher who drove a car older than some of her students. It was like something out of a romance novel. The kind of story she would have rolled her eyes at if she read it in a book. But it was real. He was real. This life was real. Her hand moved to her swollen belly. 8 months pregnant with their first child. A little girl they were going to name Grace. Everything was absolutely perfect. Garrett's eyes fluttered open. That slow, sleepy smile spread across his face. The one that always made her heart skip. "Good morning, beautiful," he murmured, his voice rough with sleep. "Good morning yourself." He reached over, placed his warm hand on her belly. "How's my little princess today?" "Active," She was doing somersaults at 3 in the morning. That's my girl. Already overachieving. He leaned over and kissed her forehead, soft and lingering. I have a surprise for you tonight. Anniversary dinner. That Italian place you love. The one with the handmade pasta. Garrett, our anniversary was last month. I know, but I was traveling for work and I missed it. That's unacceptable. I want to make it up to you properly. You deserve to be celebrated. See, this was what made him different from every other man she had ever dated. The thoughtfulness, the attention to detail, the way he remembered every little thing she ever mentioned liking. At least, that was what Rachel believed. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. A text from her best friend Diane. Girl, if he is this perfect, check his basement for bodies. I have seen too many Dateline episodes to trust a man this smooth. Rachel laughed out loud. She could not help it. What's so funny? Garrett asked, propping himself up on one elbow. Nothing, just Diane being Diane. Ah, the human lie detector. Garrett stretched and climbed out of bed, his movements easy and graceful. She still doesn't trust me. Does she? She doesn't trust any man. Her ex-husband ruined that for the entire gender. Fair enough. Can't blame her for being cautious. He kissed her one more time before heading toward the bathroom. I have meetings all day, but I'll pick you up at 7. Wear something beautiful. Not that you could wear anything else. After he left for work, Rachel got ready for her day. She stood in front of the mirror, rubbing cocoa butter on her pregnant belly, thinking about how incredibly lucky she was. Her father had died 2 years ago. Heart attack at 61 on a random Tuesday morning between his second and third cup of coffee. He had worked himself to the bone running a small construction company for 35 years, saving every penny, never taking vacations, never buying himself anything nice. He wore the same boots until they literally fell apart, and then he was just gone. No warning, no goodbye. One minute he was planning his retirement, the next minute he was lying on his kitchen floor. He left her $800,000 in life insurance, his entire legacy, everything he had sacrificed for, compressed into a number on a check. Garrett had helped her invest it wisely, or so she thought. This is your father's gift to you, he had said, holding her hands, looking into her eyes with such sincerity. We're going to make sure it grows. We're going to honor his memory by being smart with it. She had cried. He had held her. She had trusted him completely. Rachel, I want you to remember something. This is the first lesson, and it is the most important one. When someone seems too good to be true, they usually are. Not always. Sometimes you really do find a genuinely good person. But if alarm bells are ringing in your gut, even quietly, even faintly, do not ignore them. Rachel's best friend Diane had alarm bells ringing from day one. She called them her spidey senses. Rachel dismissed them as cynicism from a woman who had been burned by her own bad marriage. She would regret that dismissal for the rest of her life. That afternoon, something strange happened. Rachel was packing up her classroom after the final bell, erasing discussion questions about the Great Gatsby from the whiteboard, when a woman appeared in her doorway. Mid-50s, gray hair that looked like it had not been washed in days, clothes that were wrinkled and worn, like she had been sleeping in them. But her eyes held something desperate, something haunted. Mrs. Mitchell, the woman asked. Her voice trembled. Rachel set down her eraser. Yes, can I help you? My name is Sandra Chen. My daughter Emily is in your third period class. Oh, of course. Emily Chen. She's a wonderful student, very insightful in discussions. Is everything all right at home? Sandra stepped into the classroom. Her hands were trembling badly. She clasped them together to make them stop. Your husband, she said quietly, barely above a whisper. I know him. Rachel felt a flicker of unease in her stomach. I'm sorry. I know him by another name. Gregory Martin. Sandra's eyes filled with tears. He married me 6 years ago. He took everything I had. Every penny my husband left me when he died of cancer. And then he vanished like smoke. Rachel stared at this woman, this disheveled, desperate stranger making impossible accusations. I think you have the wrong person, she said carefully, keeping her voice gentle. My husband is Garrett Mitchell. He runs a tech company called Mitchell Dynamics. They develop software. That's what he told you. Sandra reached into her worn purse with shaking hands and pulled out a photograph. This is our wedding photo, 6 years ago in Las Vegas. Look at his face. Rachel did not want to look. Every instinct told her to refuse, to call security, to protect the perfect life she had built. But something made her take the photograph. Her heart stopped. It was Garrett, younger by maybe 5 or 6 years, different hairstyle, longer and swept back, clean shaven instead of the neat stubble he wore now, but unmistakably, undeniably, impossibly Garrett, standing next to this woman in a white wedding dress, both of them smiling at the camera. There must be some mistake, Rachel whispered. The words felt hollow even as she said them. There's no mistake. Sandra's tears spilled over, running down her weathered cheeks. He targeted me because my husband had just died. I was vulnerable, grieving, desperate for someone to tell me everything would be okay. And he swooped in like a savior, said all the right thing, did all the right things. She paused. And when I finally stopped crying long enough to check my bank accounts, they were empty, and he was gone, like he had never existed at all. Rachel shook her head. The room was spinning. This is insane. My husband is not a con man. We've been together for 5 years, and we're having a baby. I know him. Do you? Sandra pressed the photo into Rachel's hands. Really know him? Or do you just know the person he wants you to see? She reached into her purse again and pulled out a business card. It was wrinkled, worn at the edges, like she had handled it thousands of times. There are others, Sandra continued. At least 4 other women that I've found so far, all with dead husbands or fathers, all with money to steal, all with the same story. She pressed the card into Rachel's other hand. When you're ready to hear the truth, call me, before he takes everything you have left, before you end up like me. And then she walked out of the classroom. Rachel stood alone among the empty desks, holding a photograph of her husband marrying another woman, feeling the foundation of her perfect life begin to crack beneath her feet. Chapter 2. Cracks in the Mirror. Rachel did not call Sandra. For 3 days. She told herself the woman was disturbed, a con artist herself, maybe running some elaborate scheme, or mentally ill, or simply mistaken. These things happened. Mistaken identity, doppelgangers, strange coincidences that meant nothing. She hid the photograph in her underwear drawer, beneath her oldest pajamas where Garrett would never look. She went through the motions of her life, teaching class, grading papers, eating dinner across from her husband while he talked about his day at work. But she could not sleep, could not eat without feeling sick, could not look at Garrett without seeing that wedding photograph burned into her brain like a brand. On the 4th night, alone in the bathroom at 2 a.m, Rachel made a decision. She was going to prove Sandra wrong. She was going to find concrete evidence that Garrett was exactly who he said he was. And then she would burn that photograph, put this whole nightmare behind her, and never think about it again. She needed to see his office. Not with him there giving her a tour, not with advance warning. She needed to see it real, unfiltered, unexpected. At 11:45 that night, while Garrett was supposedly at a late business dinner with investors, Rachel grabbed her car keys. "What are you doing?" she muttered to herself as she backed out of the driveway. "You're 8 months pregnant, driving across town in the middle of the night to spy on your own husband." But she kept driving. Mitchell Dynamics was headquartered in a sleek office building downtown, glass and steel, 15 stories tall. Rachel had been there twice before. Once when they first started dating, when Garrett gave her an excited tour of the space. Once for the company Christmas party, where she had met his employees and shaken hands and smiled until her face hurt. But tonight, as she pulled into the parking lot across the street, something felt wrong. The building was dark, not just Garrett's floor, not just a few offices working late, the entire building, every single floor, no lights in any window, no security guard visible in the lobby, no cars in the parking garage. Maybe they close early on weeknights, she told herself. Maybe it's a holiday I forgot about. But her hands were shaking as she got out of the car. She walked to the entrance on unsteady legs, pressed her face against the glass door, cupping her hands around her eyes to see inside. Empty lobby, dark reception desk, no sign of life at all. She looked at the building directory mounted on the wall outside, ran her finger down the list of companies. Mitchell Dynamics was not there. Rachel's legs went weak. She grabbed the wall for support, pressing her other hand against her belly where her daughter was kicking. She pulled out her phone, found the main number for the building, called it with trembling fingers. It rang 6 times, then a recording. Thank you for calling Executive Suites International. For virtual office services, press 1. For mail forwarding, press 2. For conference room rental, Rachel hung up. Virtual office services, not a real company, just an address on a business card, a phone number that someone else answered, a facade, a lie. She drove home in a daze, barely seeing the road in front of her. When she walked through the front door at midnight, Garrett was there, sitting on the living room couch in the soft lamplight, a glass of red wine in his hand, that easy smile on his face, like nothing in the world was wrong. There you are, he said. His voice was warm, concerned. I was getting worried. Where did you go at this hour? Rachel's mouth was dry. I drove by your office. Something flickered in his eyes. Just for a second. So fast that if she had blinked, she would have missed it entirely. But she did not blink. Your office, he repeated. Baby, why would you do that? I couldn't sleep. Pregnancy, insomnia. I just wanted to, I don't know, see the building. Remember our first date there? Oh, sweetheart. He set down his wine and crossed to her, wrapped his arms around her. She could smell his cologne, the same scent she had always found so comforting. Now it made her stomach turn. We moved offices last month, he said gently, like he was explaining something to a child. Don't you remember I told you about it? We outgrew the old space. The new location is across town, near the river, much better for the expansion. Did you tell me that? Of course I did. At dinner. Maybe 2 weeks ago. You were tired, though. The baby's been wearing you out. He pulled back and looked at her face with such convincing concern. Rachel, what's really going on? You seem upset. Here was her chance. She could confront him right now. Ask about Sandra. Demand answers. Show him the photograph hidden in her drawer. But she looked into his eyes, those warm brown eyes she had trusted for 5 years, and the words died in her throat, because she was afraid. Afraid of what the truth might be. Afraid of what she might lose. Afraid that the life she thought she was living had never been real at all. Nothing, she heard herself say. I'm just tired. The baby's been keeping me up. Come to bed, sweetheart. He kissed her forehead. I'll rub your feet. You've been on them too much lately. And just like that, he had diffused the moment, turned her legitimate suspicion into pregnancy hormones, made her doubt herself instead of him. Rachel, this is the second lesson. Pay attention closely. Gaslighting is when someone makes you question your own reality. When they flip the script so smoothly that suddenly you are the one apologizing for catching them in a lie. He made me apologize for doubting him. He made me feel crazy for trusting my own eyes. That is what they do. They weaponize your love against you. If someone ever makes you apologize for asking reasonable questions, run. Do not walk. Run. But Rachel did not run. Not yet. She lay in bed that night, pretending to sleep, listening to his breathing slow and steady beside her. Her hand rested on her belly where her daughter was finally still. I am going to find out the truth, she promised herself. Whatever it takes. In the morning, she was going to call Sandra. Chapter 3, Down the Rabbit Hole. The diner was 20 miles outside of town. Sandra had chosen it specifically because no one would know them there. Neutral territory. Anonymous faces. Rachel arrived first. She slid into a corner booth with cracked vinyl seats and ordered a decaf coffee. She had no intention of drinking. Her hands would not stop shaking. Sandra appeared 15 minutes later. She looked even worse than before, if that was possible. Thinner, like she had not eaten properly in weeks. Dark circles carved under her eyes like bruises. "Thank you for coming," Sandra said, sliding into the booth across from her. "I almost didn't. 3 times I almost turned the car around." "I know. I wouldn't have blamed you." Sandra wrapped her hands around her own coffee cup, seeking warmth. "But you need to hear everything before it's too late. Then tell me, all of it. Don't spare me anything." Sandra took a long, shaky breath. "His real name is Marcus Wayne Brennan, born in Columbus, Ohio, 42 years ago. His mother was an addict who couldn't take care of him. He bounced through the foster system until he aged out at 18. By 22, he'd figured out how to make money without working for it. By stealing from women, by becoming their dreams come true." Sandra's voice was bitter. "He studies his targets like a hunter studies prey, learns what they want, what they need, what they're desperately missing, and then he transforms himself into that exact person." Rachel's stomach lurched. "How did he target me?" "Your father's obituary was in the paper. Local business owner, survived by his only daughter. It mentioned the life insurance policy." Sandra's eyes were gentle, sympathetic. "You were perfect, grieving, lonely, suddenly wealthy. He probably started researching you months before you ever met him." Rachel thought back to their first meeting, a charity gala for cancer research, 6 months after her father died. She had not wanted to go. Diane had dragged her there, insisting she needed to get out of the house. Garrett had approached her at the bar, started talking about how much he admired her father's construction company, said he had read about his passing in the paper, said he was deeply sorry for her loss. "He mentioned my father's book," Rachel said slowly. The memory was crystallizing, reshaping itself into something sinister. "Dad self-published this little book about business principles, sold maybe 200 copies. Garrett said he'd read it, said it changed how he thought about entrepreneurship." "Research," Sandra said flatly. "He found that book online, probably memorized key passages, used them to make you feel special, connected." Rachel had thought it was fate, a sign from her father that this man was meant to be in her life. It was a script, rehearsed, calculated, empty. "There are others," Sandra continued. "I've found 4 so far. Maria Gonzalez lost $300,000 in custody of her children because Marcus convinced a judge she was mentally unstable. Helen Winters lost her entire home, the place where she'd lived for 40 years, where her husband died in her arms. A woman named Patricia in California lost $500,000. How is he not in prison? Because he's brilliant at what he does. Everything is technically legal, joint accounts that both parties sign for, documents with real signatures. We gave him our money voluntarily. We just didn't understand what we were really signing." Rachel felt physically ill. "I need to check my accounts. Right now." She pulled out her phone with trembling fingers, logged into her banking app, navigated to the investment account where her father's $800,000 was supposed to be safely growing. The balance read $4,216. Rachel dropped the phone. It clattered against the table, screen cracking against the edge. "No!" The word came out as a whisper. "No, no, no, please no." "I'm so sorry," Sandra said. Tears were streaming down her own face now. "I'm so sorry. Rachel, that was my father's money. Everything he worked for. 70-hour weeks for 35 years. No vacations. No luxuries. He wore the same work boots until they literally fell apart because he wanted to save money for me. She was sobbing now, unable to stop. He died thinking he had given me security. He died thinking I would be okay. Sandra reached across the table and took her hands, held them tight. I know. My husband did the same thing. Worked himself into an early grave so I would be taken care of. And Marcus took every penny within 2 years. Rachel pressed her hands against her pregnant belly. Her daughter was kicking now, agitated by her mother's distress. An innocent little girl who was going to be born into this nightmare. What do I do? Rachel asked when she could finally speak again. How do I prove what he did? Sandra's expression shifted. Something hard entered her eyes. You can't prove it alone, but you don't have to be alone. She pulled out her phone, opened a photo album. Maria, Helen, me. We've been collecting evidence for 2 years, building a case, waiting for someone like you. Someone like me. Someone still in the fight. Someone who hasn't been completely destroyed yet. Someone who can get close to him and gather what we need. At that moment, Rachel felt something shift inside her chest. The grief was still there, a gaping wound that would take years to heal. The rage was building, hot and righteous. But underneath both of those emotions, something else was growing. Steel. She thought of her father, his calloused hands, his tired eyes, the way he smiled when he handed her that life insurance check 3 weeks before he died. This is for you, sweetheart, for your future. Make me proud. She was going to make him proud. She was going to destroy the man who had stolen his legacy. Tell me what I need to do, Rachel said. Her voice was steady now, cold. Sandra smiled for the first time since they had met. It was not a happy smile. It was the smile of a soldier who had finally found reinforcements. First, we need to get you some help. The kind of help that can actually put him behind bars. Chapter 4. The man in black. Rachel left the diner in a daze, her mind racing through everything Sandra had revealed. She was walking across the parking lot toward her car, keys clutched in her shaking hand, when she noticed him, a man leaning against a black sedan, tall and broad-shouldered, built like someone who had spent time in the military. Dark suit that fit perfectly, but was not flashy. Silver watch on his wrist, face that could have been carved from granite, all sharp angles and no softness. He was watching her with eyes that missed nothing. Rachel's hand moved instinctively to the pepper spray in her purse. Mrs. Mitchell, the man said. His voice was deep, calm, the voice of someone who was never surprised by anything. Who wants to know? He reached slowly into his jacket. Rachel tensed, ready to run despite her pregnant belly, but he only pulled out a badge, held it up so she could read it clearly. Special Agent James Thornton, FBI Financial Crimes Division. Rachel stared at the badge, then at his face, then back at the badge. FBI. I've been tracking your husband for 6 years, Mrs. Mitchell. Agent Thornton's expression did not change. His real name is Marcus Wayne Brennan. He's wanted in connection with fraud totaling $4.2 million. 8 confirmed victims across 5 states. Probably more we haven't found yet. Rachel's legs felt weak. She leaned against her car for support. You knew, she said. The words came out sharp, accusing. You knew what he was doing, and you just watched. You let him destroy all those women. We couldn't prove it. For the first time, something flickered in Thornton's stone face. Frustration, or maybe guilt. Every victim was too ashamed to testify. Every case fell apart before we could bring charges. He's very good at what he does. So why are you here now? Because you're different. Thornton stepped closer, lowering his voice even though they were alone in the parking lot. You're still in contact with him, still living in his house. You still have a chance to gather evidence from the inside before he disappears again. You want me to spy on my own husband. I want you to help me stop him from doing this to anyone else. Rachel studied this man, this federal agent who had been hunting her husband for half a decade. There was something personal in his eyes, beneath all that professional control, something that went beyond duty. "Why do you care so much?" she asked. "This is just a case to you. Just another file on your desk." The stone mask cracked. Just for a moment. "My sister," Thornton said quietly. "Rebecca." She was 34 years old, engaged to a man who seemed perfect. Turned out he was running the same kind of con, took everything she had, her savings, her house, her self-respect. He paused, his jaw tightened. "She took her own life 3 years ago, left a note saying she was too ashamed to go on living." Rachel's breath caught. "I'm so sorry. I couldn't save her. I didn't see what was happening until it was too late." Thornton met her eyes. "But I can save others, and I can make sure men like Marcus Brennan pay for what they do." He reached into his car and pulled out a small device, a recording device. "You're going to wear a wire, and you're going to get him to admit what he's done." Rachel looked at the device in his hand. Such a small thing, such a dangerous thing. What if he finds it? What if he figures out what I'm doing? "Then call me, day or night. I'll have agents nearby whenever you need them." Thornton handed her a card. "You won't be alone in this, Rachel. I promise you that." Rachel took the card, looked at the device. She thought of Sandra, living in her car, Maria, losing her children, Helen, losing her home, all the women who had been too broken to fight back. She thought of her daughter, kicking inside her right now, the future that little girl deserved. "There's something else you should know," Thornton said. "The woman you think is his mistress, Victoria Cole. What about her? She's not his mistress. She's his sister." The words hit Rachel like a physical blow. His sister. They've been running cons together since she was 18. She plays the role of the other woman to destabilize the marriage, speed up the divorce before anyone can do forensic accounting. Thornton's expression was grim. "She's as guilty as he is. Maybe more." Rachel absorbed this. The mistress who was not a mistress. The sister who helped destroy lives. "I'll do it," Rachel said. Her voice surprised her with its steadiness. "I'll wear the wire. I'll get you whatever you need. Are you sure this isn't without risk? If he discovers what you're doing, he stole my father's legacy. He's been lying to me for 5 years. He's the father of my child, and everything about him is fake." Rachel took the recording device from Thornton's hand. "I'm going to destroy him, one way or another." For the first time, something that might have been respect flickered in Thornton's eyes. "I'll be watching," he said. "You won't see me, but I'll be there. Always." As Rachel drove away, she did not notice the young man sitting in a car at the edge of the parking lot. He had a camera with a telephoto lens and a press badge hanging from his rearview mirror. Daniel Carter, investigative journalist for the Cleveland Tribune, had been tracking the FBI's interest in Marcus Brennan for months, and he had just found his story. Chapter 5. The wife strikes back for 2 weeks. Rachel played the perfect wife. She smiled at Garrett over breakfast, laughing at his jokes even when they made her skin crawl. She let him rub her swollen feet while they watched television. She kissed him goodnight and said, "I love you," without choking on the words, all while wearing an FBI wire taped beneath her maternity clothes. It was the hardest thing she had ever done in her life. Every time he touched her, she wanted to scream. Every time he said, "I love you, baby," she wanted to claw his eyes out. Every time he talked about their daughter, about the future they were going to build together, she wanted to vomit, but she stayed calm. She stayed focused. She gathered evidence. "The investments are all set up perfectly, sweetheart," Garrett said one evening, his hand resting on her belly. "Grace is going to have the best of everything. Private school, trust fund, the works." "Where exactly is the money invested again?" Rachel asked casually. "I want to understand it better." "Oh, you don't need to worry about that. Offshore accounts. Tax optimization strategies. Complicated stuff, but it's safe. Completely safe. Trust me. Trust me. The two words that had cost her everything. Her best friend Diane was the only person who knew the truth. Besides Agent Thornton, Diane had wanted to murder Garrett with her bare hands when Rachel told her. Instead, she channeled her rage into support. "I cannot believe you're sleeping next to an actual sociopath," Diane said one afternoon. They were sitting at Rachel's kitchen table, pretending to plan a baby shower while Garrett was at his fake office. Like an actual comic book villain, with a secret identity and a diabolical scheme and everything. "It's not funny, Diane." "Oh, honey, I know it's not funny. That's why I'm making jokes. If I don't laugh, I'm going to burn down his car with him inside it." "Hanum." Diane took a long sip of wine. "Have I mentioned lately that I never liked him? Only about 1,000 times. Well, I'm saying it again. My instincts were right. I should quit the bakery and become a detective. Your bakery is failing because you eat more than you sell. That's called quality control." Despite everything, Rachel almost smiled. Then she heard the front door open. Garrett was home early. Diane's eyes went wide. Rachel gave a tiny shake of her head. "Act normal." Garrett appeared in the kitchen doorway, briefcase in hand, that charming smile on his face. "Ladies, what are we planning?" "Look serious." Diane recovered instantly, her expression transforming into cheerful innocence. "Oh, we're just discussing how to properly dispose of the placenta after birth. Very trendy these days. Celebrities do all sorts of things with them. Some people plant trees over them. Some people make smoothies." Garrett's smile faltered. "Smoothies. Packed with nutrients. Supposed to help with recovery. Want me to save you a glass?" "I think I'll pass." He gave Diane a look that was almost suspicious, then turned to Rachel. "Baby, can I talk to you for a minute?" In the bedroom. Rachel's heart rate spiked, but she kept her face calm. "Of course, honey." She followed him down the hall, closed the bedroom door behind her. Garrett was standing by the window, his back to her. His posture was different somehow. Stiffer, more alert, like a predator sensing danger. "Is everything okay?" Rachel asked. He turned around. He was holding her phone. "Who is Agent Thornton?" The bottom dropped out of Rachel's stomach. "Who?" She forced confusion into her voice. "There's a contact in your phone. Agent Thornton, FBI. 3 missed calls today." Garrett's eyes were cold now. The warmth she had always seen there was completely gone, like it had never existed. "You've been talking to the FBI, Rachel. I don't know what you're talking about. I've never, don't lie to me." His voice was quiet, controlled, more terrifying than shouting. "I've been doing this for a very long time. I know when someone is hiding something." He stepped closer. Rachel stepped back, her shoulders hitting the door. "Take off your shirt. Garrett, take it off. Now!" Her hands trembling, Rachel reached for the hem of her maternity top, pulled it over her head, exposing her pregnant belly and the wire taped to her side. Garrett stared at it for a long moment. Then he laughed. It was the most chilling sound Rachel had ever heard. "You stupid, stupid woman." He reached out and ripped the wire away from her skin. The tape tore at her flesh. She cried out in pain. He dropped the device on the floor, crushed it beneath his heel. "Did you really think you could outsmart me?" "Me?" He was pacing now, running his hands through his perfect hair. "I've been doing this for 11 years. 11 years without getting caught. And you thought some pregnant schoolteacher was going to take me down?" Rachel pressed her back against the door, one hand protectively over her belly. "The FBI knows who you are. Marcus." He froze at the sound of his real name. "Oh, yes," Rachel continued, finding courage she did not know she had. "I know everything. Sandra told me. Maria told me. Helen told me. All the women you destroyed. They can't prove anything. They never could. Maybe not yet, but they will. I'll make sure of it." Something changed in his face. The mask fell away completely. and underneath was something cold, something reptilian, something that had never loved anyone in its entire existence. "You want to play games? Rachel, fine? Let's play." He pulled out his own phone, dialed a number. "Victoria, change of plans. Execute the contingency." He hung up and smiled at Rachel. It was the smile of a snake. "I filed papers this morning, claiming you've been embezzling from my company, that you're mentally unstable, that you're an unfit mother." He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne. "There's a custody hearing scheduled for Monday, and by the time it's over, you won't just lose your money, you'll lose your daughter too." Rachel felt the floor drop out from under her. "You can't do that. I can do whatever I want. I've done it before." His hand shot out and grabbed her arm. His grip was painful, bruising. "Now be a good girl and keep your mouth shut, or I will make sure you never see your baby again." The front door opened. Footsteps in the hallway. Victoria appeared in the bedroom doorway. Beautiful. Cold. The woman Rachel had thought was her husband's mistress. His sister. His partner in crime. "Everything's handled," Victoria said, barely glancing at Rachel. "I moved the accounts, shredded the paper trail. By the time anyone figures out what happened, we'll be ghosts." Marcus smiled. "See? Rachel, you never had a chance. You were the easiest mark yet." He released her arm and walked past her like she was nothing. Victoria followed without a word. Rachel stood alone in the bedroom, her body trembling, her mind spinning. Everything she had worked for, everything she had planned, destroyed in a single moment. She slid down the wall and sat on the floor, her back against the door, her arms wrapped around her belly. And for the first time since this nightmare began, she let herself cry. But even as the tears fell, something was building inside her. Not despair. Rage. "This is not over," she thought. "I will not let him win. I will not let him take my daughter. Whatever it takes, however long it takes, I am going to destroy him." Chapter 6. The Darkest Hour. The custody hearing was a nightmare beyond anything Rachel could have imagined. She sat at the defendant's table in a cold, fluorescent-lit courtroom, 8 months pregnant, wearing the only professional outfit that still fit over her belly. Across the aisle, Marcus sat with his expensive lawyer, looking every inch the concerned husband and father-to-be. His lawyer was good, terrifyingly good. "My client is a successful businessman with no criminal record," the lawyer said smoothly. "Mrs. Mitchell, on the other hand, has been exhibiting increasingly erratic behavior. She's been making wild accusations about Mr. Mitchell's business, stalking his office building in the middle of the night, secretly recording their private conversations." The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, looked at Rachel with skepticism. "Is this true, Mrs. Mitchell?" "Your Honor, I recorded those conversations because my husband has been stealing from me. He's not who he says he is. His name isn't even Garrett Mitchell. It's Marcus Brennan, and he's wanted by the FBI for Your Honor." Marcus's lawyer interrupted. "This is exactly the kind of paranoid delusion we're talking about. Mrs. Mitchell has been under tremendous stress due to her pregnancy. We have documentation from colleagues and friends expressing concern about her mental state." The lawyer produced a stack of papers, signed statements from people Rachel had never met, all claiming to have witnessed her erratic behavior. "Given Mrs. Mitchell's obvious instability, my client is requesting a psychological evaluation before any custody arrangements are finalized." Rachel's lawyer objected. The judge overruled. Everything was falling apart. And then the courtroom doors opened. Sandra Chen walked in. Behind her, Maria Gonzalez. Behind her, Helen Winters. 3 women dressed professionally, holding folders of documents, their faces set with determination. "Your Honor," Sandra said, her voice cutting through the murmurs, "we request permission to address the court. We have evidence directly relevant to these proceedings." "And who are you?" the judge demanded. "Victims," Sandra pointed directly at Marcus. Of the man sitting at that table, we can prove that everything Mrs. Mitchell has said is true. The judge's eyebrows rose. She looked at Marcus, whose composed expression had flickered for just a moment. I'll allow it, but this better be relevant, or I'll hold you all in contempt. During the recess that followed, Rachel met with the other women in a small conference room. How did you know to come? Rachel asked, her voice breaking. Agent Thornton called us, Maria said. He said you needed backup, so we got on a plane. We were never going to let you face him alone, Helen added. Not after everything he took from us. Sandra handed Rachel a folder thick with documents, bank records, photographs, phone records, 11 years of crimes meticulously cataloged. Helen's the one who figured it out, Sandra said. Tell her. Helen, the oldest of the group at 67, had tears in her eyes. I knew you before. Rachel, we met once, at the charity gala where you met Garrett. She took a shaky breath. Marcus approached me first that night, asked me questions about the other guests, about you specifically. I thought he was just making conversation. I had no idea. She broke down crying. I pointed you out to him, told him about your father's recent death, about the life insurance. Helen grabbed Rachel's hands. I didn't know what he was. I swear I didn't know. But I helped him target you. I led him right to you. Rachel stared at this woman, this grieving widow who had lost her own home to the same man, who had unknowingly served Rachel up on a silver platter. It's not your fault, Rachel said finally. He manipulated you too. But if I hadn't, he would have found another way. Men like him always do. The door to the conference room opened. A young man stepped in, press badge visible on a lanyard around his neck. He was maybe 30, with earnest eyes behind glasses and a notebook clutched in his hand. I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm Daniel Carter, Cleveland Tribune. I've been investigating Marcus Brennan for months. He looked at Rachel. I saw what happened in there. I have information that could help. Other victims, other aliases, a paper trail that goes back over a decade. Rachel studied him. Something about his directness, his obvious nervousness, his complete lack of smooth charm. Why should I trust you? You shouldn't, not yet. But here's my card. Everything I've found is yours if you want it. No strings attached. He paused. What he did to my cousin in Arizona. I've been trying to get justice for her for 3 years. This is the closest anyone's ever gotten. He left his card on the table and walked out. When court resumed, everything changed. Sandra presented the bank records. Maria played recordings. Helen showed photographs of Marcus with 4 different wives at 4 different weddings. The judge's expression grew darker with each piece of evidence, and then Rachel's lawyer made her move. Your Honor, given this new evidence, we request an immediate DNA test of the defendant. We have reason to believe that Garrett Mitchell is not his legal identity. Objection, Marcus's lawyer shouted. This is outrageous. A fishing expedition. Overruled. The judge's voice was ice. Mr. Mitchell, you will submit to a DNA test immediately. Something tells me we're going to find out exactly who you really are. Marcus's face went pale, then red, then twisted with a rage that Rachel had never seen before. Not even in their worst moments. And then he did the one thing that proved everything. He stood up from the defendant's table, walked toward Rachel with murder in his eyes, and before anyone could stop him, he slapped her across the face. The sound echoed through the courtroom. Time stopped. Rachel's hand rose slowly to her cheek. The skin was hot, stinging, the outline of his fingers already forming. Chaos erupted. The bailiffs rushed forward. The gallery gasped. Someone screamed. But before anyone else could reach him, Agent Thornton was there. He appeared from nowhere, moving faster than a man his size should be able to move. He grabbed Marcus by the collar and slammed him face first onto the defense table, pinned him there with one hand while pulling out his badge with the other. Marcus Wayne Brennan, you're under arrest. Thornton's voice was calm, deadly calm. For assault, for fraud, for identity theft, for everything you've done to every woman you've ever touched. He leaned close to Marcus's ear. My sister's name was Rebecca. Remember that name. You're going to have a long time to think about it. The bailiffs took over, handcuffing Marcus and dragging him away as he screamed threats and obscenities. Victoria tried to reach him and was restrained by security. Rachel stood motionless in the chaos, her hand still on her cheek, watching the man she had married being hauled away in chains. She did not cry. She did not scream. She simply watched. And when their eyes met one final time, she smiled. Chapter 7 Sisters united 3 days after the courtroom incident. Rachel was at her mother's house, surrounded by women who had become her family. Sandra, Maria, Helen, Diane. Her mother, Margaret, who had not stopped crying since she learned the truth. And one unexpected guest, Linda Brennan, Marcus's first wife, the woman he had married at 21, before he perfected his technique, the woman who bore the scars of his earliest cruelties. He wasn't a con man when I knew him, Linda said. She was in her late 40s, with gray streaked through her dark hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of hard years. He was just cruel, controlling, violent. She rolled up her sleeve, revealing a long scar that ran from her wrist to her elbow. He did this when I tried to leave the first time. Said if I couldn't be his, I wouldn't be anyone's. The room was silent. The cons started after our divorce, Linda continued. After he realized that charm worked better than force, that women would give him their money willingly if he made them believe he loved them. Why are you here? Rachel asked, not accusingly, just curious. Because I've been waiting 16 years for someone to stop him, and you did what I never could. Linda's eyes were fierce. I have his birth certificate, his real social security number, everything the FBI needs to bury him forever. The doorbell rang. Rachel went to answer it. Daniel Carter stood on the porch, a thick folder in his hands, rain dripping from his glasses. I have everything, he said. 3 more victims I tracked down, a money trail through 4 offshore banks, enough to add federal charges on top of the state ones. He held out the folder. It's all yours. No article until you say so. No story until you're ready. Rachel took the folder. Why are you helping me? Because my cousin tried to report him 5 years ago. No one believed her. She ended up in a psychiatric facility because he convinced everyone she was crazy. Daniel's voice cracked. She's still there, and she deserves to see him pay. Rachel looked at this awkward, earnest man, so different from Marcus with his smooth charm and practiced lines. Thank you, she said. Truly. I'm just doing my job, or trying to. He started to turn away, then stopped. For what it's worth, I think you're incredibly brave. What you're doing takes more courage than most people will ever have. He walked back to his car in the rain. Rachel watched him go, feeling something she had not expected. Hope. That evening, another unexpected visitor arrived. Victoria. She came alone, without makeup, without her expensive clothes. She looked smaller somehow, diminished. The bruises on her neck, poorly concealed, told their own story. I need to talk to you, she said. Please. Rachel's mother wanted to slam the door in her face. Diane made a suggestion involving garden shears, but Rachel held up her hand. Let her in. They sat in the living room, the other women watching from the doorway, ready to intervene if necessary. Talk, Rachel said. Victoria pulled up her sleeve, not like Linda had, to show old scars. This was fresh. Cigarette burns. A dozen of them, forming a pattern on her forearm. He did this to me when I was 14, the first time I tried to run away from him. Rachel's stomach turned. We grew up in foster care together, Victoria continued, her voice flat. Different homes, but we always found each other. He was the only person in the world who cared about me, or so I thought. She pulled down the collar of her shirt, more scars and more burns, a raised line across her throat that looked like someone had tried to strangle her. Every time I tried to leave, he found me, hurt me, reminded me that I had no one else, that I would die without him. Her voice cracked. I was his prisoner for 20 years. I helped him destroy all those women because I thought there was no other choice. There's always a choice, Sandra said coldly from the doorway. You're right. Victoria looked at her, accepting the judgment. There was, and I chose wrong. Every single time. She turned back to Rachel. I have everything. Every con he ever ran. Every victim. Every dollar. He made me keep records in case he ever needed leverage. Insurance. He called it. She pulled a flash drive from her pocket, set it on the table. I'll testify against him. I'll plead guilty to whatever charges they file against me. I'll go to prison if that's what it takes. Her eyes were wet but steady. I just want it to end. I want him to pay for what he did. To all of us. Rachel looked at this woman, this accomplice, this victim, this complicated, damaged person who had helped destroy so many lives. Why should I believe you? You shouldn't. Verify everything. Check every document. Assume I'm lying until you prove otherwise. Victoria stood up. But I'm not. This is the first honest thing I've done in 20 years. Maybe the only good thing I'll ever do. She walked to the door. Stopped. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. I know that doesn't mean anything. But I'm sorry. She left. The women looked at Rachel. What do you think? Sandra asked. Rachel picked up the flash drive, turned it over in her hand. I think she's telling the truth. I think she's as broken as any of us. That doesn't excuse what she did. No, it doesn't. Rachel met Sandra's eyes. But maybe it explains it. And maybe, just maybe, she can help us make sure he never hurts anyone again. Chapter 8, The Trial. The federal trial of Marcus Wayne Brennan began on a cold Monday in November. Rachel was in the courtroom every day, despite being 9 months pregnant, despite her doctor's warnings, despite everyone telling her she needed to rest. She sat in the front row of the gallery with her sisters in survival. Sandra, Maria, Helen, Linda, even Victoria, out on bail and cooperating fully with prosecutors, sat at the end of their row. 5 women, 5 victims, 1 united front. Daniel Carter was there too, in the press section. He had published his investigation 2 weeks earlier. Front page, detailed, devastating. Every other victim he had found, every alias Marcus had used, every dollar he had stolen. The story had gone viral. National news picked it up. Marcus Wayne Brennan became the most hated man in America overnight. The prosecution's case was methodical and merciless. Victoria was their star witness. She took the stand in a simple gray dress. No makeup, her scars visible. She described 11 years of cons in excruciating detail. How they identified targets, how Marcus built trust, how they executed the fraud, how they disappeared. Why did you participate? The prosecutor asked. Because I was afraid. Because I was conditioned to believe I had no choice. Because he had been controlling me since I was 11 years old. She held up her arm. The cigarette burns were visible even from the gallery. This is what happened when I said no. When I tried to leave. When I showed any sign of independence. Her voice was steady. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm just telling you the truth. Finally, Marcus's defense attorney tried to discredit her, called her a liar, a scorned lover, a woman trying to save herself by blaming her brother. Victoria did not waver. Yes, I'm trying to save myself, she said. I'm trying to save my soul, because I don't want to die knowing I helped him destroy innocent people and never did anything to stop it. One by one, the other victims testified. Sandra described losing everything, living in her car for 6 months, Eating from food banks? Considering suicide, Maria described losing her children, the custody battle she fought for 3 years, the therapy her kids still needed. Helen described losing her home of 40 years, the house where her children were born, the house where her husband died. Linda described the violence of their marriage, the broken bones, the hospital visits, the terror of living with a monster. And then it was Rachel's turn. She walked to the witness stand, 9 months pregnant, head held high. State your name for the record. Rachel Ann Dawson. Not Mitchell, not Brennan. Her own name, her own identity. She told her story from the beginning. The charity gala, the whirlwind romance, the wedding, the pregnancy, the discovery. When did you first suspect something was wrong? The prosecutor asked. When a woman I had never met appeared in my classroom and told me my husband had married her 6 years earlier under a different name. Rachel looked at the jury. I didn't believe her at first. I couldn't believe her, because believing her meant everything I thought I knew about my life was a lie. What made you change your mind? Evidence, research, the courage of the women who came before me. Rachel's voice grew stronger. These men count on our shame. They count on us being too embarrassed to fight back, too humiliated to stand up in a courtroom and admit we were fooled. She looked directly at Marcus for the first time. But I'm not ashamed. I trusted my husband. I loved him. That wasn't a weakness. That was humanity. What he did with that trust, the way he weaponized my love against me. That was the crime. The defense attorney tried to break her, suggested she was mentally unstable, that her pregnancy hormones had affected her judgment, that she had been complicit in the fraud. Rachel did not bend. I am a high school English teacher, she said. I drive a Honda Civic with 120,000 miles on it. I thought I was living a normal, happy life with a man who loved me. She paused. He saw my trust and he used it to steal everything my father spent his entire life working for. That is not my crime. That is his. The closing arguments took most of a day. The prosecution laid out 23 counts: wire fraud, identity theft, money laundering, assault, conspiracy. The defense argued reasonable doubt, coerced testimony, entrapment. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they filed back in, Rachel held her breath. Sandra gripped her hand on one side. Diane gripped her hand on the other. On the count of wire fraud in the first degree, how do you find the defendant guilty? The word hit like a hammer. On the count of identity theft, guilty. On the count of assault in the second degree, but guilty. On the count of conspiracy to commit fraud, guilty. 23 counts, 23 guilty verdicts, each one a nail in his coffin. Marcus sat motionless through the first 10 verdicts. By the 15th, his composure started to crack. By the 20th, his face was purple with rage. At the 23rd verdict, he exploded. He leapt from his chair, overturning the defense table, screaming at the jury, at the judge, at Rachel. This isn't over. You hear me? This isn't over. I'll get out and I'll find you. I'll take everything. Agent Thornton was out of his seat before the bailiffs could react. He crossed the courtroom in 3 strides and slammed Marcus back into his chair with enough force to knock the wind out of him. Shut up, Thornton said quietly. Just shut up and take what's coming to you. The bailiffs took over, dragging Marcus out in chains as he continued to scream. Victoria watched her brother being hauled away. Her face showed nothing. No satisfaction, no grief, just emptiness. Rachel touched her shoulder. It's over, Rachel said. No. Victoria's voice was barely a whisper. For him, it's just beginning. Chapter 9, Karma. The sentencing hearing was held 3 weeks later. The courtroom was packed. Victims, supporters, journalists, curiosity seekers. Everyone wanted to see the final chapter. Rachel was there, of course, 1 week past her due date now, her doctor on speed dial, but refusing to miss this moment. Marcus was brought in wearing an orange jumpsuit. No more expensive suits. No more charming smile. He looked smaller somehow, diminished, like the removal of his mask had taken something vital with it. The judge looked at him with undisguised contempt. Marcus Wayne Brennan, you have spent over a decade preying on vulnerable women. You targeted them at their lowest moments, when they were grieving, when they were lonely, when they were desperate for someone to love them. She paused. You stole their money. You stole their dignity. You stole their ability to trust. You destroyed lives with no remorse and no conscience. Marcus stared straight ahead, his jaw tight. I have read the victim impact statements. I have heard the testimony. I have seen the evidence of the devastation you have caused. The judge leaned forward. For the crime of wire fraud, I sentence you to 15 years. For identity theft, 5 years consecutive. For assault, 3 years consecutive. For conspiracy, 2 years consecutive. She let the numbers sink in. Marcus Wayne Brennan, I sentence you to 25 years in federal prison. You will be 67 years old when you are eligible for release. Marcus finally reacted. His face went white. That's my whole life, he whispered. Yes, the judge said. It is. The bailiffs came to take him away. As they led him past the gallery, past the rows of women he had destroyed, Marcus made one final play. He looked at Rachel with tears in his eyes. Rachel, please. I'm sorry. I never meant to. Save it. Rachel's voice was ice. I hope you rot. They dragged him out. Rachel felt something release in her chest, something she had been carrying since the day Sandra walked into her classroom. It was over, but the karma was just beginning. 3 days after sentencing, Rachel went into labor. Grace Eleanor Dawson was born at 3:47 in the morning, weighing 7 pounds, 4 ounces. Perfect, healthy, screaming at the indignity of being born. Rachel held her daughter for the first time and cried, not from sadness, from joy, from relief, from the overwhelming knowledge that this innocent child would never know the man who fathered her, would never be touched by his poison. You're going to have everything, Rachel whispered against Grace's tiny head. Love, truth, a mother who will fight for you until her last breath. The other women crowded into the hospital room. Sandra brought flowers. Maria brought a stuffed elephant. Helen brought a hand-knitted blanket she had been working on for months. Diane burst in with balloons and a cake that said, Welcome Grace in pink frosting. I'm officially the fun aunt, Diane announced. I've already started planning how to spoil her rotten. Even Victoria came. She stood in the doorway, uncertain, holding a small gift-wrapped box. I wasn't sure if I should come, she said quietly. Rachel looked at her. This woman who had helped destroy so many lives, who was now trying, imperfectly, to make amends. Come in, Rachel said. Meet Grace. Victoria approached the bed slowly, looked down at the baby with something like wonder. She's beautiful. She's a survivor, like her mother. Victoria set the gift on the bedside table. I start my sentence next week. 3 years, minimum security. She paused. When I get out, if you'll let me, I'd like to help with the foundation. Help other women who've been where we were. We'll see, Rachel said. One day at a time. Meanwhile, across the state, Marcus Wayne Brennan was beginning to understand what 25 years really meant. The federal prison was nothing like the county jail where he had awaited trial. No private cell, no special treatment, just a concrete box with bars and a roommate who had killed 3 people. His first night, he lay on his thin mattress, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of men shouting and crying and fighting through the walls. The news had traveled ahead of him. Everyone knew who he was, what he had done. The con man who stole from widows, the pretty boy who slapped his pregnant wife in court. He was not going to have an easy time. 3 months in, a guard slid a letter through his cell door. It was from his mother, 91 years old, living in a nursing home. The woman who had abandoned him to foster care when he was 6. He had not heard from her in decades. He tore open the envelope with shaking hands. Dear Marcus, I saw you on the news. They showed what you did to all those women. They showed you hitting that pregnant girl in the courtroom. I abandoned you when you were a child because I couldn't take care of you. I have carried that guilt for 60 years. I always wondered what you became, what kind of man you grew up to be. Now I know. You are a monster. Whatever I did to you, however I failed you, nothing excuses what you chose to become. You are no son of mine. Do not contact me. Do not write. Do not ask for anything. When I die, you will not inherit a penny. You will not come to my funeral. You will be alone and as you deserve to be. Goodbye. Marcus, I hope the next 25 years give you time to understand what you've done. Your mother, Dorothy Brennan. Marcus read the letter 3 times. Then he crumpled it into a ball and threw it against the wall. And for the first time in his adult life, he cried. Chapter 10, Rising from Ashes. 1 year later, Rachel stood in front of a crowd of 300 people, wearing a dress that actually fit again, feeling like a different person than the woman who had walked into that courtroom. Because she was a different person. The Dawson Foundation for Fraud Survivors was celebrating its first anniversary. In 12 months, they had helped over 200 victims, provided legal assistance, financial counseling, therapy, a community of people who understood what it meant to be betrayed by someone you loved. When I started this foundation, Rachel said into the microphone, I thought it was about revenge, about making sure Marcus Brennan paid for what he did. She paused. I was wrong. It's not about him at all. It's about us, about the women and men who trusted the wrong person, who lost their money, their homes, their self-respect, who thought they were alone in their shame. She looked out at the audience. Sandra was in the front row, now the foundation's head of financial services. Maria sat beside her, running the family support program. Helen was there, hosting support groups in the home she had finally gotten back. Even Linda had a role, speaking at conferences about the warning signs of domestic abuse. You are not alone, Rachel continued. You are not stupid. You are not weak. You are targeted by predators who spend their entire lives learning how to manipulate people exactly like you. She felt tears pricking her eyes but pushed through. The shame is not ours to carry. The shame belongs to them. And the best revenge, the only revenge that matters, is this. She gestured to the room. The supporters, the survivors, the foundation that was changing lives, building something beautiful from the ashes of what they destroyed. The applause was thunderous. After the speeches, during the reception, Daniel Carter found her. They had been seeing each other for 6 months now, slowly, carefully, neither of them rushing anything. That was incredible, he said. Your dad would be so proud. I hope so. I think about him every day. Daniel reached out and took her hand. Nothing fancy, nothing smooth, just honest connection. There's something I want to ask you, he said, but not here, not tonight. Okay, just think about whether you might want to grab coffee with me. Real coffee, not foundation coffee. Maybe this weekend. Rachel smiled, a real smile, the kind she had thought she might never feel again. I think I'd like that. Across the room, Diane caught her eye and gave an exaggerated thumbs up. Rachel laughed. Later that night, after the guests had gone and Grace was sleeping peacefully in her crib, Rachel sat alone in her new apartment. Not a mansion, not a huge house, just a comfortable 2-bedroom place that she could afford on her teacher's salary plus the foundation stipend. She turned on the television, flipping through channels, and there it was, a news segment about her foundation. Her face on screen, her voice talking about helping survivors. She thought about Marcus, sitting in his prison cell, seeing this, the woman he had called the easiest mark yet, building an empire of compassion from the ruins of his cruelty. She hoped he was watching. She hoped it burned. 5 years later. Rachel stood at the altar, Grace beside her as flower girl, and watched Daniel walk toward her. Not a fancy wedding, not hundreds of guests, just family, just friends, just the people who mattered. Sandra was her maid of honor. Maria, Helen, and Linda were her bridesmaids. Even Victoria was there, 3 years out of prison, now running the foundation's hotline for victims who had nowhere else to turn. Do you, Rachel Ann Dawson, take Daniel James Carter to be your lawfully wedded husband? I do. Do you, Daniel James Carter, take Rachel Ann Dawson to be your lawfully wedded wife? I do. Grace tugged at Rachel's dress. Mommy, is Daniel my daddy now? Rachel knelt down to her daughter's level. He's going to be the daddy who chose you, she said. The daddy who loves you because he wants to, not because he has to. Okay, Grace thought about it. I like that kind better. The reception was held in the Foundation's community center. 300 survivors, staff, supporters, and friends, celebrating love rebuilt from wreckage. Daniel's first dance with Grace was to You Are My Sunshine. He held the 5-year-old on his feet, spinning her around while she giggled. Rachel watched them, her heart so full it hurt. This is what survival looks like, she thought. Not just enduring, thriving. In a federal prison cell 800 miles away, Marcus Wayne Brennan was watching television. He was 52 now. His hair had gone gray. His face was lined and weathered. He had been in prison for 5 years, with 20 more to go. The news came on, a segment about the Dawson Foundation, about its founder, Rachel Dawson Carter, about the 500th survivor they had helped this year. They showed footage of Rachel at the Foundation's annual gala, smiling, confident, beautiful. They showed her wedding, her husband, her daughter, the daughter who called another man daddy. They showed the Foundation's new community center, the expanded staff, the national recognition, and then they showed Rachel's face, close up, as she delivered the line that had become the Foundation's motto. The best revenge is becoming everything they said you couldn't be. Marcus stared at the screen. The woman he had dismissed as easy prey, happy, successful, surrounded by love, while he rotted in a cell, abandoned by everyone. He picked up the remote and threw it at the television. It cracked the screen, but didn't break it. Rachel's face was still there, smiling at him through the fractures. Brennan, unechoing. The guard's voice echoed down the corridor. That's coming out of your commissary. You hear me? Marcus didn't answer. He just sat on his concrete bed, staring at the broken screen, feeling the weight of every year he still had left to serve. 20 more years of watching her win. 20 more years of knowing he had created the very thing that destroyed him. 20 more years of nothing. In his pocket, he carried a worn piece of paper, a news clipping from 3 years ago. His mother's obituary. She had died without forgiving him, without speaking to him, without leaving him anything. He had not been allowed to attend the funeral. He had no one left. No family, no friends, no allies, no hope. Just time. Endless, crushing time. 2 years later, Rachel was at her desk at the Foundation when her phone rang. Mrs. Carter, this is Warden Thompson at Federal Correctional Institution. I'm calling about Marcus Brennan. Rachel's hand tightened on the phone. What about him? He passed away this morning. Heart attack. He was alone in his cell. Rachel was silent for a long moment. Thank you for letting me know. She hung up. She should have felt something. Satisfaction, relief, closure. But she felt nothing. Marcus Brennan was dead. The man who had stolen her father's legacy, destroyed countless lives, and tried to take her daughter away. Dead at 54, alone in a prison cell, unmourned and unloved. She thought about calling Sandra, Maria, Helen, the other women whose lives he had destroyed. But first, she needed to sit with this. She walked to her office window, looked out at the community center where survivors gathered every day, at the children playing in the courtyard, at the staff helping a new victim fill out paperwork. This was her legacy now. Not him, not what he took, what she built. She picked up the phone and called Daniel. "Hey, honey, what's up?" "Marcus is dead." Silence on the other end. "How do you feel?" Rachel considered the question. Really considered it. "Free," she finally said. "I feel free." That night, she held Grace on her lap and read her a bedtime story. Daniel sat beside them, his hand on Rachel's shoulder. A family, a real family, built on truth instead of lies. "Mommy," Grace said sleepily, "tell me the story about the brave lady again." "Which brave lady, sweetheart? The one who beat the bad guy and helped all the other people." Rachel smiled. "Once upon a time, there was a woman who trusted the wrong person. He took everything from her money, her confidence, her belief in happy endings." Grace's eyes were drooping, but she was listening. But the woman didn't give up. She found other people he had hurt. Together, they became an army, and they made sure he could never hurt anyone again. What happened to the bad guy? He went away for a long, long time, and he spent every day knowing that the people he hurt were happy without him. "Good," Grace murmured. "Bad guys should be sad forever." Rachel kissed her daughter's forehead. "Yes, baby, they should." She carried Grace to bed, tucked her in, watched her drift off to sleep with a smile on her face. Then she went back to the living room where Daniel was waiting. "Are you okay?" he asked. "I am." She sat beside him, leaned into his warmth. "I really am. I love you, Rachel. I love you too." Outside the window, the stars were coming out, the same stars that had shone on her darkest nights, the same stars that had witnessed her reconstruction. She thought about her father, what he would say if he could see her now. She knew exactly what he would say. "I'm proud of you, sweetheart. You took the worst thing that ever happened and turned it into something beautiful. That's what survivors do." Rachel closed her eyes and let herself rest. She had earned it. The endo one, sure. Final lessons before you go. Let me share the lessons Rachel learned the hard way. Lesson 1. When someone seems too good to be true, they usually are. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Lesson 2. Gaslighting is when someone makes you apologize for catching them in a lie. Never apologize for asking reasonable questions about your own life. Lesson 3. Shame is the predator's greatest weapon. They count on you being too embarrassed to fight back. Take that weapon away from them. Lesson 4. You are not alone. There are always others who understand. Find them. Build your army. Heal together. Lesson 5. The best revenge is not destroying them. It is becoming everything they said you could not be. Call to action. If this story touched your heart, hit that like button. It helps more than you know. Drop a comment below. Have you ever trusted someone who turned out to be completely different? Your story matters. Sharing it might help someone else recognize the signs. Send this to a friend, a sister, a daughter, anyone who needs to hear it. You never know who might be in the middle of their own nightmare right now. And if you are new here, subscribe and tap that bell. We bring you powerful stories of women who refuse to stay down, because every ending is just a new beginning. And remember what Rachel taught us. The best revenge is becoming everything they said you could not be. See you in the next story.